The bakery on Larkspur Street. So this is where people end up when they can't hold a real job, Vivian Cross said, laughing thinly as the bakery's door swung shut behind her. The man in the flour-dusted apron by the oven was Nathan Reeves, the single father she had fired weeks earlier for taking a few days off to care for his dying mother. She added, almost sweetly, that it was good he'd finally found work baking for somebody else. Nathan only smiled. He never mentioned that he owned the place, or that within days the whole country would know his name. Nathan Reeves had spent 11 years learning the difference between something that was almost right and something that was exactly right, and that difference had never once made him rich. At Bramwell Foods he'd run quality control on a factory floor the size of 2 football fields, walking the line before dawn while the ovens were still cold, tasting, measuring, sending back whole batches when a crust came out a shade too pale. Older men called him careful. Younger ones called him slow. He answered to both with a short nod and a quieter insistence that the work be done properly, because he'd learned young that being trusted was the only currency he could count on. He was 35, rose early every morning in a small rented house on the edge of town, made coffee he rarely finished, and drove to a job he did well and didn't love. What he loved lived somewhere underneath all of it, folded away like a recipe card he no longer had the nerve to read. Years earlier he'd wanted to cook. More specifically, and more foolishly, he'd wanted to own a bakery, a real one, his own name on the glass, his own bread in the window. He'd told almost no one. A dream you never say out loud can never be laughed at, and Nathan had spent a long time protecting his from laughter. The person who did the laughing at Bramwell, when laughter was required, was Vivian Cross. She'd taken over the company younger than anyone expected, and wore that fact like armor, daring someone to test it. To Vivian, a business was a spreadsheet that happened to breathe, and every person in it was a number that climbed or fell. She wasn't cruel in the theatrical way that makes for easy villains. She was worse, in a sense, because she was efficient. She could end a man's livelihood in the time it took to close a laptop, without ever raising her voice, and she believed sincerely that the restraint made her fair. Nathan had worked under her for 3 years without ever truly being seen. He was a line on a report labeled quality assurance, reliably green, and green numbers don't require attention. He preferred it that way. He came in earlier than asked and left later than he was paid for, assuming, in the plain arithmetic of a decent man, that this ledger of loyalty was being kept somewhere, that it would protect him if the day ever came when he needed protecting. That assumption was the most expensive thing he owned, and he didn't know it yet. The day it came due began with a phone call at 4 in the morning. His mother, Eleanor, had collapsed in her kitchen. She lived 40 minutes away, alone in the house Nathan had grown up in, having raised him by herself through years, lean enough that he still flinched at throwing away bread. Now she was lying in a hospital bed with tubes in her arm and doctors using the careful, weighted language people use when preparing you for the worst without quite saying it. Nathan didn't think about Bramwell Foods in that hospital room. He thought about it later, in the hallway, coffee going cold in his hand, when he realized he'd need a few days, enough to get her settled, talk to specialists, sit with her so she wouldn't be frightened and alone. He called the office before sunrise, left an honest message explaining what had happened, and asked for the short leave he had every reason to believe he'd earned. He drove in 3 days later to sign the paperwork, unshaven, running on almost no sleep, and was told his meeting had been moved onto the open floor, in front of the shift managers he trained and covered for over the years. Vivian was waiting with a folder she didn't need to open, because she already knew what was inside. She told him, in front of everyone, that his absence had cost the department a critical audit window. She said the word reliability the way a person sets down something heavy, and said that a man who disappeared the moment things got difficult wasn't someone a company could build around. Nathan tried to explain, his mother, the hospital, the message he'd left. Vivian lifted one hand, not sharply, just enough, and told him everyone had a reason, and reasons didn't run a business. "We need people who show up," she said. "You didn't." She thanked him for his years of service in the same tone she might use to decline a lunch invitation. And he understood that the ledger he trusted, the careful record of every early morning and unpaid hour, had never existed anywhere but in his own head. He handed back his badge, said something quiet no one quite caught, and walked out through a door he'd passed through more than 2,000 times. The second it closed, he stopped being a man with a career and became a man with a problem. The weeks that followed drained his savings and his pride in equal measure. He learned, the way people do in small towns, that word travels, and the word on Nathan Reeves was that he'd walked out on a good job when it counted. The truth didn't matter, the shape of the story had already hardened. What stopped him from simply taking whatever job came along was a Tuesday drive he took for no reason but to be moving, and a building on the wrong end of Larkspur Street with butcher paper in its windows and a fading sign announcing it was closing for good. It had been a bakery once. Through the glass he could see the ghost of it, the empty cases, the cold ovens, a path-worn pail in the tile where someone had stood for years doing the one thing Nathan had always wanted to do. He called the number that same afternoon. The woman who answered, Della Hayes, sounded like someone who'd already grieved a thing before losing it. She'd run the place a long time, and her hands carried the permanent white creases of someone who'd stopped noticing they were there. She walked him through the building by flashlight, showed him the oven that worked and the two that didn't, and didn't oversell any of it. It's not a good investment, she told him plainly. But it was a good bakery. There's a difference, and most people can't tell it. Nathan told her he could. It was, he realized as he said it, the truest thing he'd said in weeks. He spent nearly all his remaining savings, the wall meant to stand between his mother and disaster, and signed the papers in a lawyer's office that smelled of old coffee. Afterward he sat in his truck for a long while, not driving anywhere, having just bet the last solid ground under his feet on something everyone in his life would have told him not to do. That evening he told Eleanor. He hadn't planned to, he'd meant to let her believe he'd found something steady, but she read his face the way he read a crust, and he found he couldn't lie to her. He told her the real numbers. She was quiet a long while, her thin hand resting on the blanket, and then asked only one question: if it failed, could he live with having tried? He thought about the door at Bramwell and the sound it made closing, about years of green numbers that counted for nothing. If I fail, he said slowly, at least I'll have failed at my own thing. Not somebody else's. Something in his mother's face eased. She told him that was the only kind of failure worth risking. That she'd spent her life failing at things that belonged to other people, and if she had one regret, it was never being brave enough to fail at something of her own. Go build it, she said. She intended to be well enough to taste it. He went back to Larkspur Street the next morning with a box of tools and no clear plan, the honest condition of anyone who's ever begun something that matters. He tore the butcher paper down himself, and light fell into that dead room for the first time in months, across the worn path in the tile where Della had once stood. By every measure Vivian Cross would have recognized, Nathan had just made the worst decision of his life. He rolled up his sleeves, found the one working oven, and started learning how to be exactly right at the only thing he'd ever truly wanted to do. The first month nearly broke him quietly, the way real difficulty usually does. The proofing cabinet held no heat. A pipe wept a slow stain across the floor. The crooked front door announced every entry like a complaint. He fixed what he could with his own hands because he could no longer afford anyone else's, learned to solder, learned what could be salvaged and what had to be replaced, usually at 2 a.m, with no one to see, a former quality manager on his back under a leaking sink. He was in by 3, mixing and shaping in the cold, baking through dawn, selling through the day, cleaning through the evening, repairing through the night, and driving to the hospital in the gaps to let his mother believe things were going better than they were. The town didn't make it easy. Word had already decided who Nathan Reeves was, and the fact that he'd sunk his savings into a dying bakery only confirmed it. Some mornings he baked 40 loaves and sold 6, and in the long silences when the bell over the door didn't ring, he heard the town's doubt as clearly as if it had been spoken. What saved him wasn't strategy. It was the bread. He turned 11 years of insisting on exactly right onto his own recipes with something bordering on obsession, testing flours until his hands knew them by feel, learning the exact minute a dough wanted to leave the oven, throwing away anything nearly good. He wasn't a trained baker. He was something trained bakers often stop being, a man who cared about every single loaf as if it were the only one. The first curious customers found a crust that shattered the right way and a crumb that tasted like something remembered rather than bought. They came back, and brought someone. Della became one of his first regulars, sitting at the counter twice a week telling him the plain truth about what she tasted. The most valuable thing anyone gave him that season. By the second month, 6 loaves a day had become 30, and the bell over the crooked door had stopped being a rarity. It was survival with the faint outline of a future in it, which, for a man in Nathan's position, was very nearly the same thing as hope. Vivian walked in on an ordinary Thursday during one of the market surveys she insisted on conducting herself, having parked on Larkspur Street by accident and stepped inside a bakery with a modest line, purely out of professional habit. She was cataloging foot traffic and price boards when the man behind the counter looked up and her expression shifted from assessment to something colder and more pleased. She delivered her line about people landing where they land, laughed the same thin laugh she'd used on the open floor at Bramwell, and looked him over like a cautionary tale that had arranged itself conveniently for her inspection. Nathan didn't correct her. The impulse was there, sharp, immediate, to tell her the lease was his, the bread was his, the line of people behind her had come for something he'd made and not a paycheck someone handed him. He let it go. He'd learned in the last 2 months that the fastest way to lose was to argue with a conclusion instead of outlasting it. So he served her, as he served everyone, plain, unbothered courtesy that gave her nothing to push against. She lingered, as if waiting for him to plead his case, and when he didn't, she left with a small, satisfied shake of her head, certain she'd witnessed a man at the bottom of his descent. She didn't know that the same quality that made him serve her without a word was about to change everything. 11 days later, Marcus Lane walked in, and unlike Vivian, he was actually looking. He produced a food program that toured the country finding small places that did one thing extraordinarily well, and he'd driven 40 minutes on a rumor because rumors were his whole business. He took one bite and stopped. Asked who the baker was. Asked where Nathan had trained. Told the truth. Nowhere, 11 years telling other people when their bread was wrong before he ever learned to make it right himself, and Marcus, not a man easily astonished, was astonished. In 15 years of driving down county roads, he said, he'd tasted plenty of good bread and very little of the other thing, the thing that couldn't be taught. He wanted Nathan on the show, featured, national. Nathan said yes before fear could talk him out of it. Word of the coming attention reached Vivian in filtered, second-hand form, and she folded it neatly into her existing conclusion. A desperate man had taken a low job, the bakery was having a moment, none of it changed anything about the man. She was still right about him. Being right was the thing she protected above almost everything else. Then, 4 days before filming, everything nearly came apart at once. The second oven, nursed through 2 months of solder and patience, died for good on the one night he needed every inch of oven space. The next morning, his flour supplier called. The delivery he'd built the whole segment around would be badly late, possibly not until after the crew had come and gone. He sat on an upturned crate in the gray light before the town woke, feeling the full weight of how far he'd reached and how little was holding him up. But he didn't let himself sit there long. He called the supplier back, calm, and asked plainly whether any partial load could reach him in time. A smaller quantity was available from a nearer warehouse, not the grind he'd planned around, but close. 11 years of quality control had never let him accept close enough. The last 2 months had taught him a second lesson, that demanding ideal conditions was worthless if it left you with nothing, and that a great baker finds what's right hidden inside what's barely adequate. He drove to the warehouse himself, loaded the sacks by hand, and spent most of a night mixing test batches, adjusting water by feel, chasing the right result out of a substitute he'd never planned to use until, before the third dawn, he found it. Della came in on the second morning, saw the dead oven and the exhaustion on his face, and without being asked took over the front counter so he could stay at the bench. The morning the crew arrived, Nathan had been awake for the better part of 2 days, and the bakery smelled exactly the way he'd spent 2 months teaching it to smell. Marcus never learned how close it had come to collapsing. He only saw the bread, and the bread was exactly right. On camera he asked where a man learns to bake like this, and Nathan gave the same unpolished, true answer: nowhere. 11 years learning the difference between good and right before he had the courage to make anything himself. The segment aired 3 weeks later, a few minutes inside a larger episode, and it did what Marcus had spent 15 years chasing. It put the untaught, unteachable thing in front of the whole country at once. By the next morning there was a line down the block on Larkspur Street. Nathan sold out by 9, sold out again by noon, and the bell over the door rang so constantly he stopped hearing it as sound and started hearing it as weather. The town that had already decided who he was quietly updated its verdict, the way towns do, and claimed cheerfully to have known all along there was something special about that place. Nathan let them. Vivian saw the segment by accident, television on for company on a Friday night, when the camera found a bakery she recognized before she understood why. Then the man behind the counter, sleeves pushed up, hands white with flour. The same apron. The same man she'd assumed was baking for someone else, whose defeat she'd been so certain she'd witnessed. Then the program named him not as an employee, but as the owner. The baker. The man who'd made the thing the whole country was now being told to want. She watched the rest without moving. She heard him say he'd trained nowhere, heard him say he'd spent 11 years telling other people their work was wrong before he ever made anything of his own, and understood, slowly and unpleasantly, that those 11 years had been spent partly on her floor, reduced to a green line on a report she'd never once read closely. She had held his whole ledger in her hands and seen only a missed audit window, throwing away the rest without ever knowing what it contained. What reached her wasn't that he'd succeeded, she respected success, it was the only language she'd ever truly spoken. What reached her was that she'd been wrong, specifically and publicly, in a way no spreadsheet could fix. She'd fired a man for tending his dying mother and called it reliability. She'd stood in his bakery and mocked him for a job he didn't have, over a defeat he wasn't experiencing, and he'd served her without a word and let her leave still believing it. He hadn't needed to correct her. The truth had simply outlasted her, exactly as he must have known it would. She went back to Larkspur Street on a weekday morning, early, and stood across the street longer than she'd have admitted before making herself cross and go in. The bell rang over her the way it now rang over everyone. Nathan looked up and knew her, and whatever he felt didn't show. He'd had a long time to learn not to show it. She didn't lead with an excuse, which for Vivian Cross was an extraordinary act of restraint. She said his name first, told him she'd seen the program, and said she'd come to say something she should have said months ago and had been too certain of herself to say. She told him she'd been wrong to fire him the way she had, in front of everyone, without letting him explain about his mother, and that calling it reliability had been a way of avoiding what it actually was, a decision made by someone who'd stopped seeing the people on her own floor as people. "I owed you an apology a long time ago," she said. "I'm sorry for how I did it, for what I decided about you, and for standing in this room laughing at a man who'd built something I couldn't have built." Nathan let the apology land before answering, not performance, but because it deserved to be received rather than deflected. He told her, evenly, that he accepted it, and meant it. He wasn't a man who collected grievances, and he'd carried enough weight in recent months without adding hers to it. But he wouldn't let her leave with the tidy version. She seemed to want the redemptive story, in which her cruelty had accidentally been a gift. He told her plainly it hadn't. Losing his job hadn't been a favor, it had nearly destroyed him and his mother both, and if the lesson she was taking from this was that her decision had done him some kind of good, she'd learned the wrong thing again. What built the bakery wasn't the door she'd closed, it was that he'd refused to stop after she closed it. That credit belonged to him, and to a sick woman who'd told him from a hospital bed that the only failure worth risking was failing at your own thing. Vivian took that the way a person takes a truth they can't argue with, quietly, with a changed face. She'd come expecting to be told the ending justified the middle. Instead, she was told the ending had been won in spite of her, one sleepless night at a time, by a man she'd written off, and that no broadcast and no line down the block could turn what she'd done into anything other than what it was. She didn't defend herself. She bought a loaf, paid like everyone else, and the bell rang over her as she stepped out into the ordinary morning. The change in Vivian didn't announce itself, because real change rarely does. She went back to her company and to a floor she'd never truly walked, and slowly, against every habit her career was built on, she started reading the reports differently, asking who the green lines were, learning the names and the circumstances behind the absences. When someone came to her one afternoon needing a few days for a family emergency, she recognized the shape of the moment she'd once gotten catastrophically wrong. She didn't get it wrong again. She never told anyone why. The bakery on Larkspur Street didn't fade after its overnight moment the way such moments often do, because the bread had always been the point, and holding up was the one thing Nathan knew how to make it do. Other programs followed Marcus's lead, and the small place with the crooked door became one of the names people said when they talked about where the real thing was still being made by hand. Eleanor recovered enough to keep the promise she'd made from her hospital bed. Nathan drove her to Larkspur Street on a slow Sunday and stood her in the middle of the floor where the butcher paper had once blacked out the windows, and watched his mother eat the bread her son had bet everything to make. The arithmetic he'd run a dozen times in his truck, the arithmetic that had never once come out reassuring, had somehow, against every number, come out right. He thought sometimes about the door at Bramwell Foods and the sound it made closing behind him, and found he'd stopped feeling anything sharp when he did. A door had been shut on him by someone who saw him as a line on a report. He'd spent his last dollar and his last reserve of nerve prying open a different one. With his own name on the glass and his own bread in the window, and that second door turned out to be the only one that had ever truly been his to open. Sometimes the door another person closes in your face is the very thing that forces you to build the one that was always meant to be yours. Lasting success doesn't come from other people's recognition, and it doesn't come from the moment your worst critic is proven wrong. It comes from the plain, unglamorous courage to chase the thing you love and the harder courage to stand back up, one sleepless night at a time, after everything you had has been taken away.